What secret was revealed when cleaning out the home of a deceased family member? Not a secret, but a near secret. My grandfather, who spoke English as a third language, was a bit of a hoarder. Lots of old shit stockpiled in his basement, but well organized. Imagine a generic episode of Hoarders, but with a prepper OCD vibe. Everything was sanitized, stacked/nested, and grouped logically. It was like the stockroom for a store that wasn't yet sure what products it was selling and wanted to be ready. So we find a cylindrical container that was kinda heavy for its size, and it had the label Old Penis. It was one of those black plastic film containers. Hesitant, but curious, we removed the lid. It contained a collection of 1-cent pieces which had been minted in the first half of the 20th century. Part of me is disappointed, part of me is relieved. I'm African American and my husband is white. My father faced a lot of prejudice during his lifetime and I was terrified of telling him that the white guy I'd been on a date or two with I was getting serious with. The first time I brought my now husband home, my dad was courteous, but distant. Miraculously, by the second time, my father literally gushed all over my husband. Even my siblings were shocked. When we got married, he was beaming. It was odd, but I was just happy my husband had won him over. My mom died in 2014 and my father in 2021. When my siblings and I went to clean out the house, in a safe along with other important documents, we found letters that my husband had written to my father 24 years before about how he felt about me, how he was serious about his relationship with me, how he was planning to go to law school, he did, he's an attorney now, how he respected that he'd gone through so much in his lifetime, and eventually how he loved me and how with his blessing, he was going to propose. My husband never told me he'd written my father and my father never told me he'd been corresponding with my husband. It was so emotional finding those. I still tear up when I think about it. When I got home, my husband finally showed me the letters my father had written. Back. After my grandfather died, I asked my dad to quietly go through his dad's bedroom while I took my grandmother out to lunch. I explained that granddad might have racy magazines about, that would be upsetting to grandma if she found them. So just, be a good son and save your mom from that. When we got back, my dad was nearly hysterical, half laughing, half barfing, and pulled me into the garage to debrief. Apparently, my grandfather was exactly the devout Catholic that he had appeared to be. And what my poor father had found in the bedside table was a stack of cheesecake pictures of his own mother. Mine was confirmation of a wild story. My grandfather served in Korea. For years, there was a tall tale about how he won a house in Korea, unsure how to phrase this politely online, that it included the family who owned it and essentially anyone who worked there in a game of poker. That when he returned home, after a few years of receiving letters and small payments, my grandmother told him to give the ownership back to the family. I don't think anyone really believed him when the story was told, over and over again. My grandmother died when I was young, so couldn't ask her if it was true. When he passed away and we were cleaning out the house, we found the letters from the family and the letter from the lawyer Gramps used to officially return ownership. My grandpa owned a pleasure house in Korea, is a sentence that's hard to say. My parents were getting back together. Dad died at 50 of a heart attack, Mom was devastated. Her health declined rapidly and she died at 49 3 months later. I cleaned out both their homes and found calls, texts, and love letters. They wanted to be together again but didn't want to put their kids and grandkids through a reconciliation until they were confident it'd work out. I knew she'd be devastated. They had been together almost 30 years, but they were 2 years divorced and casually seeing other people. They seemed to be thriving apart. So it was a shock when the grief was so strong that it took all the life out of her. She died of cancer, but the doctor also diagnosed her with failure to thrive brought on by the loss of my dad, and said that it may have been possible for her to live longer and even receive treatment if the failure to thrive hadn't taken everything she was before her cancer diagnosis. The only thing worse than losing my dad was watching my mom live without him. so at the end of the day, I'm grateful she didn't live without him for long. She never would have had peace here again. She found her peace with him on the other side. My grandfather was put in a juvenile home in the 40s. My aunt found letters my grandfather received while there when she was cleaning out his house after he died. One was from a sister teasing him about how she bet he wished he was in school instead for once. Apparently, a neighbor had accused my grandfather of stealing a chicken, and he was taken away. My great-grandfather had died, so my grandfather was the man of the house, and my great-grandmother didn't speak English. We don't know many details, other than that he was there for close to a year. My grandfather's older brother was injured in the war and sent back to the States to recover, and once he was able to walk again, he got my grandfather out. The neighbor who called the police on my grandfather was my grandmother's mother. We knew my originally British, naturalized Canadian great-grandmother was an amateur historian who was fascinated by Britain's war with Napoleon, not the least because she was tangentially related to the Duke of Wellington's family via a cousin by marriage. What we didn't know is that, likely in preparation for a book she never wrote, she had actually interviewed several dozen elderly English, French and Spanish veterans about their experiences during that war, including 3 actual survivors of Waterloo, 2 English, 1 French, and an aide-de-camp to Spanish General Francisco Javier Castanos, who was there when his commander handed the Napoleonic army its very first defeat in the field, at the Battle of Bailén in 1808. But there it was, stored under her bed among old calendars and copies of Family Circle magazine, nearly 300 pages of military memoirs all laid out in 3 languages, in which she was fluent, in her elegant, Spencerian hand. My parents donated her manuscript to the Imperial War Museum, where no doubt it will never have human eyes laid on it again. My mother's foul evil second husband was even worse than we knew. We found extensive files he kept on everyone and pages of his crabbed handwritten notes about how he was superior to everyone and how stupid and worthless my mother and her children are. It may sound like I'm making a fuss out of nothing, but his hatred emanates off the pages. He told people that he actually wrote the book she wrote. Provably false. He deliberately kept them poor, hoping that it would spur her to write a bestseller and he could live off the wealth. He tried to kill her at least once that we know of, and the last time I ever spoke to that evil man was when somehow my mother's oxygen got turned off and somehow she dialed my phone number in her sleep. I could hear the machine clicking and couldn't get her to answer. I called the police in their city and state and got an ambulance out there. He subsequently called me and screamed at me for calling for an ambulance for my mother. He was the meanest, most evil person I ever met in my life. Thankfully his first wife raised their 2 children, who are superlative human beings, and nothing like that miserable POS.